Chapter 2, Riding the Trail. After the Civil War, when soldiers came home to Texas, they found the place swarming with longhorn cattle. Now, longhorn, as the name tells you, are cattle with long horns growing out of their heads. They are a tough breed and can walk great distances. And if there is a grass to chew, they can even fatten up on the journey. The Texas Longhorn were descended from cattle brought to America by Columbus and the Spaniards who followed him. The Longhorns were running loose on the range. There they bred and multiplied and were soon so numerous that people were killing them for their hides and throwing away the meat. The ex-soldiers knew beef was expensive back east. Now, if they could find a way to get the cattle east, why, there was money to be made. About this time, Jesse Chisholm, who was half Scot and half Cherokee, drove a herd of cattle north from Texas to Kansas and made a map of his route. The route had plenty of grass for grazing and enough water, and it led to Abilene, Kansas. In Abilene, Joseph G. McCoy was paying $40 a head for cattle. $40 was a powerful lot of money in those days, especially since you could get longhorn in Texas for about $5. If you had a herd of 1,000 or more steers and cows and got them to Abilene, well, you can figure it out, but you'd be rich. The Kansas Pacific Railroad reached Abilene in 1867, so Joe McCoy could ship the longhorns east in railroad cattle cars and make a lot of money for himself, which he did. He made a whole lot more money than he ever expected. And he became famous. Have you ever heard of the real McCoy? Some say that was Joe. Remember Chicago, the little town where Abe Lincoln campaigned? Well, most of Joe McCoy's cows and steers got shipped to Chicago. That city, some people call it the Windy City, was both a port and a railroad center. It was a distribution hub. When refrigerated railroad cars were developed, Chicago became the meat packing capital of the country. Most of the bovines that traveled Jesse Chisholm's trail got turned into steaks in Chicago. Thanks to railroads and ships, they were devoured in Norfolk, Scranton, and Mobile. For the next 20 years, the Chisholm Trail, that's what they named it, was a ribbon of longhorn. More than 1 million cattle were driven north on the trail. Who drove the herds? Why, cowboys, of course. What did the cowboys do when they got to Abilene? Get paid, buy fancy new duds, and have a good old time? Did they get rich? Not the cowboys. They were paid about $90 or less for the 2 to 3 month journey from the Texas Panhandle across the Red River through Indian Territory, over deserts, rivers, and prairie. It was the cattlemen who owned the cows and steers who got rich, but that's another story. What the cowboys got was a way of life that turned them into legends. Some people call cowboys knights of the prairie, and they were like knights. They rode with amazing skill, handled danger with bravado, and had their own code of honor. It may sound glamorous, but it was not an easy life. There were killers on the Chisholm Trail. Here are some of them: brutal heat, ferocious blizzards, biting hail, angry Indians, rattlesnakes, quicksand, rustlers, thirst, and most common of all, stampedes. A herd of cattle will stampede at the drop of a frying pan. Here's how one cowboy described it. While I was looking at him, this steer leaped into the air, hit the ground with a heavy thud, and gave a grunt that sounded like that of a hog. That was the signal. The whole herd was up and going, heading right for me. My horse gave a lunge, jerked loose from me, and was away. I barely had time to climb into an oak. The cattle went by like a hurricane, hitting tree with their horns. It took us all night to round them up. That cowboy was lucky. There was a tree to climb, and the cattle didn't knock the tree over. If they had, it would have been goodbye, cowboy. Cowboys were usually up before dawn and were often still hard at work into the night. But there was something about the life that most of them loved. As one cowhand said, to ride around the big steers at night, all lying down, full as a tick, chewing their cuds and blowing, with the moon shining down on their big horns, was a sight to make a man's eyes pop. Pretty soon it got to be a regular thing traveling the Chisholm Trail. Herds of 2 or 3 thousand cattle became common. Usually a dozen cowboys were hired to handle a herd, with a trail boss and a cook. The cook was important. Cowboys got ornery if the coffee wasn't strong and the food decent. Like other Americans, cowboys were a mixture, some white, some black, some Mexican, some, like Jesse Chisholm, part Indian. Some were women. It was democratic out there on the trail. People were judged by what they could do, not by the color of their skin, the accent in their speech, or their sex. Elizabeth E. Johnson was a school teacher in Texas before she brought some cattle and became a cowgirl. In 1879, she drove her own herd up the Chisholm Trail to the market. When she died 45 years later, she was worth more than $2 million. Most cowhands wore tight-fitting clothes, leather chaps, floppy vests, fancy boots, and broad-brimmed hats. Clothes adapted from those of the cattlemen who had come to the western land from Spain. Much cowboy lingo was Spanish: chaps, lariat, rodeo, ranch, and lingo too. It was a lonely life they led, so they livened it up by singing around the campfire and telling tall tales, like the one about the cowboys who ran out of fence posts in a snowstorm when they had to fence the herd in. So they hammered frozen rattlesnakes into the ground and strung wire on them. It would have worked, except there was a thaw and the fence just crawled away. In the Kansas cattle towns, there were twice as many saloons as other businesses. On the trail, grub was dished up from the chuck wagon. It had shelves and drawers for coffee, flour, beans, and sugar. A swinging leg held the open box lid and turned it into a tabletop. And Abilene? What happened to Abilene? It was the first of the Wild West towns, and maybe the wildest of them all, with saloons and pistol-packing cowpunchers raring for a good time. A town like that needed a marshal, and Abilene got the most famous one of all, James Butler Wild Bill Hickok. Hickok had once been a bad hombre himself, a gambling man who had 2 pearl-handled pistols and was known as the fastest draw in the West. He could shoot the hat off a man and keep the hat in the air with his bullets, and when it finally dropped, it would be rimmed with a circle of bullet holes. At least that was the story he told. Hickok was a sharp dresser who wore a coat with satin lapels, parted his long hair in the middle, and slicked it in his mustache with bear grease. Wild Bill was paid a big salary, $150 a month, for keeping law and order in Abilene. He did a fair job for a while, although most of the time his office was at a gambling table. Then he shot 2 people. He'd done that before, but it just happened that one was his deputy. That was too much for the good folk of Abilene. They got rid of Hickok and the cattle market too. Abilene settled down and became respectable. After that, the cowboys and their longhorns headed for the new towns of Wichita and Dodge City. About 1875, Dodge City became the main railhead for the shipping cattle eastward. Most say it was an even wilder place than Abilene. And its peace officers, Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, well, you should read about them. By the end of the century, when the railroads crisscrossed the land and barbed wire fenced it in, the heyday of the wild cow towns was over.